Wuthering Waves' story has been praised pretty highly since 2.x, but one of the main criticisms it continues to draw is that the villains kinda suck. Although Frolova has a compelling story and everyone loves to hate Cristoforo, overall they still leave a lot to be desired, especially in regards to what their end goals are, outside of, just nebulously aiming at human evolution, how what they do furthers their aims in any way, and what the underlying rationale powering their organization even is. 3.5's story has introduced us to another villain, but this time one that is not either a member of the Fractsidus or a Threnodian. And in my opinion, he's the best part of the story, and it all leads back to the final boss of philosophy. Here's why. One of the clearest ways in which Muyu is a real step up from the Fractsidus is that he has a real, sympathetic, and comprehensible goals. Throughout the course of 3.5's story, I actually found a part of me siding with him. His fear of sentinels, these otherworldly, powerful beings that we rely on unilaterally to save us, just deciding one day to stop protecting humanity, makes a lot of sense. It's like being locked in a room with a soldier during a zombie apocalypse. The soldier may say that he's going to protect you, and may even do so for a while, but once the supplies start running low, or the zombies start creeping closer, or you grow entirely dependent on him, what's to stop him from demanding more and more of your share of the rations? Or demanding that you do something for him? Or just him leaving you entirely? At the end of the day, wouldn't you rather be the one with the gun? In addition, while it's a logical fear, it's also a highly relatable, emotive one. Unlike the broad goal of human evolution championed by the Fractsidus, Muyu's goal is one that many people can relate to. His fear is a type of fear that many of us grow up with. The fear of our parents or guardians, one might even say sentinels, abandoning us, leaving us, not loving us anymore, simply because we did the wrong thing, said the wrong words, or simply weren't good enough. This fear is so widespread that one of the main pillars of contemporary attachment psychology is that children must experience unconditional caregiver love. This represents a huge step up in Wuthering Waves' storytelling capacity. While some stories benefit from having an incomprehensible antagonist, Kura's emphasis on the human characteristics and personalities of both the Fractsidus and the Threnodians, while keeping them incomprehensibly vague, means that in trying to have their cake and eat it too, Kura is often left with no cake at the villain party? This is a bad analogy. Either way, the Fractsidus being incomprehensible just makes them feel more frustrating than existentially threatening. In contrast, Muyu's goals both make sense and are more emotionally resonant. Another area in which the Fractsidus often fall flat as villains is in their plans. A large part of the emotional payoff in defeating the villain stories is seeing how the antagonist's plot unravels, and how the protagonist overcomes the hurdles that are thrown their way. This is an emotional well that has pretty much never been tapped by Wuthering Waves, as almost every story ends with some variation of, oh, this was the Fractsidus plan all along. This might be satisfying if the players could see how the ending ends up benefiting the Fractsidus, but there's never even an inkling of that. The vague nature of the Fractsidus plans makes them unnecessarily difficult to follow, and the fact that Kura always feels the need to have them secretly come out on top just means that the plans have to, by default, be incredibly convoluted. To be frank, it reads more like cope than anything else. This is where Muyu presents yet another upgrade in the storytelling department. His plan is immediately clearer to the audience than the Fractsidus. This immediately makes the story more compelling on a beat-by-beat level, as it presents clear win-loss conditions for both sides, and makes the importance of the things that both pro and antagonists do clearer and more prominent, and makes events easier to place on the line of cause and effect. While some may argue that this represents a dumbing down of the complexity of Wuwa's story, I don't think that's the correct way to look at things. Ultimately, the correct artistic choice to make is whatever ends up best serving the purpose of the art, and the general purpose of Wuwa's story is about telling compelling narratives, and also selling gacha characters, but that's an aside. Thus, while Muyu's plan of overthrowing or becoming independent from the Sentinels is of a lower conceptual complexity than reaching the next stage of human evolution, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, as it allows for stories that are more satisfying, comprehensible, and ultimately moving. Another strength that comes with having an antagonist with comprehensible goals and plans is that it allows them to properly act as a foil for the protagonist. Having two sides of a conflict be diametrically opposed to each other is a time-honored way of telling stories. It presents a natural thing for the sides to be fighting over, heightens the level of contrast between the two sides, and also serves as a way for conflicting opinions to enter into a dialogue about both the merits and failings of each other's viewpoints. This was previously something that was somewhat impossible with the Fraxidus, as the aim of human evolution is both too broad and too vaguely good to diametrically oppose. Obviously, no protagonist is going to be out there championing human devolution, and it's impossible to oppose human evolution because what that actually means within Wuwa is never codified. What does it entail? What are its ramifications? Why should I care? At the end of the day, Rover is almost always fighting against the Fraxidus' methods as opposed to their morals. On the other hand, Muyu, by having a goal that is well grounded in the fear of the other, can actually serve as a proper contrast to our characters. We already see this in Yang Yang, whereas Muyu's power is driven by his innate distrust for the most uncontrollable part of a person. Yang Yang's ascension into her Shuangling form is mediated by the fact that she recognizes the inherent value of other people's opinions, thoughts, and emotions. Thus, we can see that making the antagonist more understandable makes not only their characterization stronger, but also the protagonist by contrast. Lastly, I think Muyu is great because his aims, fears, and personality are well grounded in the philosophical tradition. And moreover, a lot of the improvements we've already talked about are driven by how well considered he is in this regard. While both the Fraxidus and Threnodians occasionally draw on references to the broader literary canon, none of them feel as informed from the ground up by the topics that they're interfacing with as Muyu is by Hegel's master-slave dialectic. Hold on, I hear you say. What the hell is a dialectic, and what's it got to do with my gacha game? Okay, good question. Dialectics is simply a method of arriving at the truth, or a better truth, through the conflict of two contradicting points. Say for example, I say the 5-star rate is 0.8% in Wuthering Waves. And then you say, actually, 5-star rates are not always 0.8%. They can technically go up to 10% if you're in soft pity. Well, that's also true. We can combine these two opposing points to come to a more accurate truth by saying the 5-star rate in Wuthering Waves is generally 0.8%, but increases once you hit soft pity up to a maximum of 10% or whatever. Thus, dialectics is the study of the tension of opposing ideas and how they can interact and combine to create a more true idea. Okay, so what is the master-slave dialectic? The master-slave dialectic is an application of dialectics that Hegel believed takes place in the journey of human consciousness. There's a lot to it, as one might expect from one of the most influential fragments of Western philosophy, but don't worry, we'll only be talking about a specific part of it that is relevant to Wuthering Waves. Hegel posits that the first step to consciousness is a person perceiving the things of the outside world, that is, they subject the objects of the world to their understanding. The problem is that you can't know that you're a subject, i.e. someone with self-consciousness, by just looking at objects, because objects don't have their own subjectivity, they can't recognize you. Therefore, in order to know that you are a self-conscious being, or in other words, a subject, you need to be recognized by another self-conscious being who is also a subject, but a subject that's not you. So you think to yourself, simple, two subjects meet and then they just have to recognize each other as fellow self-conscious people, right? Well, Hegel says it's not that simple. See, one of the things that he says is an important aspect of self-consciousness is that the self-conscious have absolute free will and independence. This becomes a problem because if I recognize you as a being with absolute free will and independence, that means that you have the will and capacity to deny the fact that I am a subject with free will and not an object for you to act upon. This is why this dialectic is called the master-slave dialectic, because through an unequal recognition of free will, one subject can become a master over the other. At the same time, however, we can't just walk away from this conflict because we need the recognition of the other in order to exist and know who we are. This manifests in the desire for both sides to be perceived while also trying to avoid becoming the object that perceives. A simple way to get your mind around this conflict is by considering the following quote from Cooley. I am not what I think I am, and I am not what you think I am. I am what I think you think I am. Okay, but what the hell does this have to do with my gacha game? Great question. I believe that Muyu's characterization, and to a lesser extent Yang Yang's as well, is highly informed by a reading of this dialectical conflict. We can see this first in the way that Muyu's power actually works. He takes the emotions, the thoughts, the subjectivity of others, and makes them objects that serve his will. This is especially resonant when we consider the way in which his power primarily manifests through the control of auto-puppets, tools that are explicitly meant to be used without the consideration of their own wills. In addition, this contrasts neatly against Yang Yang's powers, which are explicitly driven by her recognition of others, whether that be their memories, emotions, or will. More prominently, we can see this in Muyu's core fear. His fear stems from the fact that what he wants, what he wills, can be overridden by the will of someone else. That he could be the object and not the subject. This is why he seeks to gain independence from the Sentinel. Hell, let's take a look at the specific term he uses to refer to them. He calls them higher wills, a subjectivity and desire that supersedes and overrides his own. Lastly, let's think about the way that Muyu goes out. As soon as he's defied, as soon as Rover confronts him with a greater will, he becomes a puppet, a thing without subjectivity. Okay, so Muyu may or may not be written with Hegelian dialectics in mind. Why does that matter? Personally, the most enlightening aspect of viewing Muyu and the broader story of 3.5 from the perspective of Hegelian dialectics is that it helps make thematic sense of the final fight, and in particular this moment. When I played this section of the story, I wasn't sure what to make of this moment. While it's clear that Yang Yang is severing the thread of control between Muyu and the auto puppets or the memories of the souls he's using to control them, what I wasn't sure is how. Of course, I'm sure there's a perfectly cromulent lore reason as to how she does it, probably something to do with her azure feathers being able to negate frequencies or something. But my main concern is as to how she does it narratively. Or in other words, what is the greater thematic meaning behind her doing it? What does it represent? You know, that sort of thing. I think understanding the story from the perspective of Hegelian dialectics gives us an answer. Narratively, Yang Yang is able to free the people that Muyu has subjugated by recognizing them as subjects. We can see in the mid-fight interlude that Yang Yang does not seek to cut the ghosts down or subjugate them as Muyu does, but rather respects their perspective, consciousness, and subjectivity enough to lament their fates instead. This recognition of their free will restores their ability to make choices and allows them to break free from Muyu's grasp. It elevates them from object to subject. Viewing this story from a dialectical perspective also actually helps us point out why Muyu is the villain. As previously mentioned, I've seen both myself and many others say that Muyu isn't really wrong. And from a purely logical perspective, I stand by that. There is every chance that Sentinels could just up and abandon, or worse, betray humanity. What the addition of the dialectical perspective gives us, however, is the insight to say that the point isn't that Muyu's fears are unfounded, but rather that even if the Sentinels were to betray humanity, that's still fundamentally their choice. Just because the perspectives of others contradicts, or has the chance to contradict our own, doesn't mean we have the right to subject those people to our will unilaterally. This is also how Muyu fixes Wuthering Waves' antagonist problem. Unlike the Fraxidist, he's not just a plot device with a vague endgame. He represents an actual idea in the story which our protagonists can, and in a sense have to, interface with. And whether or not that argument is, in actuality, built on Hegel or not, it says something that his worldview feels so robust and well considered that the claim can even be made in the first place. It's also worth considering the fact that, unlike the Fraxidist, these ideas extend to the real world too. Many of the ills we see in the world around us exist as a result of the fact that we forget that the people around us are humans, with their own dreams, their own stories, their own struggles, their own set of circumstances. How often do we see people honk angrily at someone cutting in front of them on the road, assuming that the person must be a bad, inconsiderate driver? How often do we see people refuse to give money to the homeless, assuming that they must just be lazy? How often do we see the victims of sexual misconduct be accused of asking for it? Even if we're not literally taking the emotions out of people and twisting them for our own needs by putting them into auto puppets and trying to create a rebellion against the Sentinel that controls humankind, we do often subject other people to our own ideas of who they are. We, in a sense, reduce them to being objects by denying their perspectives, lived experiences, and story, and substituting it with our own fixed ideas on who they are instead. Perhaps we can take a leaf out of Yang Yang's book, viewing others on their own terms, and accepting the validity of who they are, even if we don't agree with their personal choices. Hi all, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, feel free to, do the YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe, and if you didn't, feel free to tell me why. I really love getting constructive criticism because it helps me know, what areas I can improve on.